Today's daf is daf Tezvav, but we have to start now on daf Yudalit and Beis to finish up yesterday's daf. So we're up to Amalei, which is approximately, I would say, 15 lines up before the end of the Amalei. So Rav Yosef says to Abai, Imkain, Abai was the one who said that with regard to Dine Nefashos, that's capital cases, on Chol Moed, then there's going to be a period of Iyune B'dine, which means deliberation, and they're not going to announce their verdict immediately, because once they announce their verdict, then they have to be in abstention from Achila and Shasiyah, which would undermine Simchas Yontif. So Rav Yosef attacks Abai and he says, Nimtzeis, according to you, Ma'ane es hadin. This is called Ini Adin, which means that when you're in the process of judgment in a capital case, then you're not allowed to delay the final judgment. And in the Masechet writes, Harei kashera nidon roe she'ino kvar bedino, when the person who's being accused of a capital crime sees and he's aware of the fact that they already looked into his judgment, the eni yadeh, but he doesn't know ma pasku, what was their final decision, mis'anahu b'kach, he goes through psychological torment. The also lanos dino shel adam, and this is prohibited, and it's a violation of Yahavta l'reacha kamocha. Ella, therefore, says Rav Yosef, the Brisa is talking about a case where they have to announce their verdict, and even to implement that verdict and execute the condemned criminal on Chol Moed. And yet, when we have Didi Mamanos, the judges will not have to forfeit the mitzvah of Simchas Yontif and abstain from Achil and Shasiyah. Why not? Because Asu Mitzafra Miyani Bedina. In the morning on that same day, they will investigate the case, and then they'll take a break. Aili v'achli v'shasu kuliyoma, for the rest of the balance of the day, they'll be eating and drinking, fulfilling the mitzvah Simchas Yontif. And the Iser of Achil and Shasiyah only applies after the Gemar Din, once they've issued the final verdict. So Hadar Asu B'Shkiyas Achama, at the end of that same day, Gamrina Ladine, that's when they will finalize the din and issue the final verdict, condemning the accused for a capital punishment to be executed, and they will execute him. So in this way, there's no Iniyat din, because on the same day that they were ma'ayim the din, they actually do the Gemar din, and they will execute him on that same day. There's no bittul of Achil and Shasi and Simchas Yontif, because in the interim, between the commencement of Inu B'din and the final Gemar din, there's the entire day during which they'll be involved in Achil and Shasi. Omar Abai, Toshma. Abai says, I have a brisa, actually a Mishnah, that refutes your opinion, because it says, Umenuda shitiru lo chachamim. In the case of someone who's in nidui, then if the Bezdin release him from his nidui on Chol Moed, he's allowed to cut his hair. Which means that even though we don't cut hair on Chol Moed, but that's because a person was expected to cut his hair before the Moed. In the case of someone who's in nidui, he's enjoined from cutting his hair, and they were only matir his nidui on Chol Moed, and therefore he's allowed to cut his hair. But we see from this that the Mishnah is telling me that anytime a person who's in nidui is mutar on the matir, the releasing of him from the nidui took place during the course of Yontif, so that on the one hand, Chazal said that the mitzvah of rejoicing on Yontif should trump the nidui, and that's why as soon as they have a heter, he's allowed to take a haircut and cut his hair on the moed. So it seems that according to the Mishnah doesn't mention any individual circumstance that precipitated the release, and Abaye understands as a general release by rabbinic decree, and that's opposed to Rav Yosef's opinion. Rava comes to defend Rav Yosef, and he says, tiruhu chachamim. It doesn't say that he was released by the chachamim. The Mishnah just says that sheitiru lo chachamim katan. What does that mean? He tiruhu lo, that they released him. It doesn't say that he tiruhu. The azul ufaise lebal dine. He was excommunicated because he had stolen money from someone or in some way caused him financial loss. And now he goes to that person and he asks for appeasement. He asks him to be mochel him. The asi kame the Rabbanon. Now he comes in front of the Rabbanon and he presents his claim in front of the Rabbanon that he was able to appease his Baldin, and therefore Rabbanon Sharule, they'll release him from his state of need. And now we start a long sugya that analyzes the isurim that apply, number one, to an avel, number two, to a mitzora, number three, to a menuda, and number four, to a nazi. Okay. So the Gemara begins by asking the following question: Mitzora, ma'u sheyanek tzaraso beregel. The Torah imposes upon a mitzora a long list of prohibitions and restrictions, and if he observes those restrictions, he's going to undermine Simchas Yantiv. For example, the mitzora is not allowed to cut his hair. He's not allowed to launder his clothes. We'll have issues about whether he's allowed to greet people or not greet people. And all of these will undermine his Simchas Yantiv. So what trumps what? What is more important? The niug and the observance of his tzaras, or the kiyum of Simcha Beregel? Amar Abai Toshma, we have a Mishnah. Now a Mishnah says the following: he's allowed to cut his hair during Chol Moed when he goes through a transition from Tuma to Tara. So in other words, at the end of the Mishnah teaches that a mitzora is allowed to launder his clothes during Chol Moed. The implication is that's only when he enters into the state of Tara. But during his situation of Tuma, if he's going through a process of purification, but right now he's still Tameh, and now it's Yantiv, then we're going to allow him to cut his hair, which is part of the requirements of purification. And Bimei Tumaso, Nohig, he is Nohig all that he's restricted from as a mitzora. And even though Simchas Yantiv is now going to be pushed down, but nevertheless, the power of Simchas Yantiv is not great enough to trump his Nihugei Tzaras. So the Gemara says, no. Lo mi boy come. The way you read the Mishnah is a lo mi boy. It's not excluding Yemei Tumah. It's lo mi boy Yemei Tumah, so the lo noi. It goes without saying that while he's in his state of Tumah, he does not observe the restrictions of Tara because the mitzvah of Simchas Yantiv trumps Saras. Aval Taraso, this is the Chiddush that the Tana of the Mishnah wants to teach us, that during his purification period, Nigzar, we might think, Shema Yasha Karbanosov, we should not allow him to cut his hair on Chol Moed because he might come to postpone the bringing of his karbanos on until the last day of Yom Tov, Kamash Malan. So here we have a long note that we'll read here. It's note 44. Once the Mitzorah cuts his hair on the seventh day of his purification process, he becomes immediately obligated to bring his 3 karbanos. He has 3 categories of karbanos that he brings to complete his purification and allow him to enter into the mikdash. He's called a mechusar kapara until he brings those sacrifices. Now, we're talking about a case of an overlap between the last day of Yontif and his Tara process. The 7th day, which falls during Chol HaMoed. So the 7th day of his Tara process is now on Chol HaMoed. What's the fear? Why are we afraid that he might delay bringing his karbanos? Because he has to bring them on the last day of Yontif, which is forbidden. Individuals are forbidden to offer their sacrifices. We're talking about a karban yachid on Yontif. If it's not Chol HaMoed, it's Yontif. Now, the Havamina here is that he may delay bringing his karbanos, and that would be a transgression. We should prohibit the Mitzorah to cut his hair on the 7th day of his Tara process when it's on Chol HaMoed, so as to defer the obligation to bring his karbanos until after Yontif. Kamash Malon, so the Tana wants to teach us that we don't have this decree, and we're not afraid, so you cannot bring a proof from the Mishnah as to whether or not Simchas Yontif trumps Tzoras. Omar Rava Tashma, but I can derive it from a brayso of Atzarua. The Torah says a person with Tzoras, and that's an extra word, L'Rabos Kohen Gadol. That means that a Kohen Gadol can become a Mitzorah. So the question is, how can a Kohen Gadol become a Mitzorah? HaKohen Gadol L'chol Hashana K'regel L'Kuli Almadam. His status during the entire year is that of Simcha. He's in the status of Simchas Yontif the whole year round. Tisnan, and this is a Mishnah in Masechet Horios, Kohen Gadol Makriv Onein V'Eino Ochel. A Kohen Gadol, even though he's in Onein, he had just lost one of his close relatives, he could still be Makriv. He's not allowed to eat the karbanos from the boss of the carbon, but he's a Kohen HaMakriv. Why? Because he has the status of regel, which prevents his aninus from inhibiting him from doing the avodah. Shma mina, we see that noeg tzaraso baregel, that from the word sarua, we derive that even though it's regel for the Kohen Gadol, nevertheless, he's noeg his tzaras. Shma mina, so we have a clear-cut proof that the law is that tzaras over trumps Simchas Yontif. Ovel osur b'tispores. How do we know that a mourner is enjoined from cutting his hair? Mida ka'amar le'rachmanu l'bnei Aaron, HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded Elazar v'Tamar after the loss of their brothers Nadav Avihu, Rashechem al tifro, you should not shave your head, or actually the other way around. You should not leave your head parua. Parua means without a haircut, to grow wild. Bichlal, since HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to command the brothers of Nadav Avihu that they should not leave their hair uncut, to Kuli Alma also. Another person in the state of Avelus, other than Nadav Avihu, would be Asur. He's not allowed to cut his hair. And now we turn to Daf Tesvav.